In June 2003, a peat cutting machine in central Ireland dragged something unexpected to the surface. The partial remains of a man, headless, limbless, covered in the dark slime of the bog. Police were called. A forensic pathologist was dispatched. The assumption was murder. They were right. But the killing had taken place 2,000 years ago. Within months, a second body surfaced nearby. Same era, same region, same deliberate, ritualistic wounds. Grock's analysis of the combined forensic, botanical, and historical data points to a single conclusion, one that rewrote what we thought we knew about Iron Age Ireland. These were not victims of random violence. They were not soldiers fallen in battle. The evidence encoded in their bodies, the wounds, the last meals, the careful placement in the bog, tells a story far darker and far more deliberate than murder. This is what happened to them, and why. The machine operator who made the first discovery in June 2003 had no idea what he was looking at. A peat harvesting machine working a bog in County Offaly in the Irish Midlands dragged something to the surface. At first glance, it looked like little more than dark, matted organic material, the kind of debris that bogs routinely throw up. Then someone looked closer. What they found were the partial remnants of a human body. No head, no lower limbs. The arms extended outward in a semicircular position, as though frozen mid-gesture. Detective Aidan Campbell was among the first officers on the scene. He described lifting the black plastic sheeting that covered the find and being confronted with one of the most remarkable sights of his career. This was not a recent death. The preservation was extraordinary, but the condition of the remains made clear that whatever had happened here, it had not happened recently. Forensic pathologist Dr. Richard Shepherd was called in to examine the body. His assessment was immediate. There was no possibility, he said, that this person had died from natural causes. The evidence of decapitation was clear. So was the evidence of dismemberment carried out after death. This was a body that had been subjected to extreme and deliberate violence. Samples were taken for radiocarbon dating. When the results came back, they astonished everyone connected with the investigation. This man had lived and died approximately 2,400 years ago, in the centuries before the birth of Christ. The police had not uncovered a modern murder. They had uncovered an Iron Age one. He was named Oldcroghan Man, after the townland in County Offaly, where he was found. Then, just months later, and roughly 40 kilometers to the north, a second body emerged from a bog near Cloneycavan in County Meath. Again, the preservation was remarkable. Again, the injuries were severe. Again, the radiocarbon dating placed the death firmly within the Irish Iron Age, somewhere between 400 BC and 200 BC. He was named Cloneycavan Man, 2 men, found within months of each other. Separated in death by 40 kilometers, but by almost nothing in time, both from the same ancient territorial region of central Ireland. Both subjected to violence that went far beyond what any ordinary killing would require. Ned Kelly, keeper of antiquities at the National Museum of Ireland, had spent years studying Irish bog bodies. When the results from both finds landed on his desk, he recognized immediately that something significant had happened. This was not coincidence. The bodies themselves would confirm it. But first, they had to be read. The first thing Dr. Shepherd noticed about Oldcroghan Man was his size. In the Iron Age, the average male stood around 5.5 feet tall. Oldcroghan Man was significantly larger. Broad shoulders, enormous hands, a physical presence that would have made him immediately conspicuous in any crowd. At first glance, the body of a warrior, or a man accustomed to hard physical labor. But the hands told a different story. When examined closely, the fingernails were immaculate, trimmed, clean. There were no calluses, no scarring of the kind left by years of fieldwork or heavy labor, no signs of the repetitive physical stress that marked the hands of farmers, soldiers, or craftsmen. This was a man who had never worked the land. Someone had taken care of him, or he had taken care of himself, in a world where that kind of care was a privilege very few could afford. On his left arm, he wore a leather armlet fitted with copper alloy mounts. Archaeologists consider such objects markers of high social status. In the Irish tradition, armlets carried an additional significance. They were associated with solar worship, linking their wearer to the religious and ceremonial life of the community. Then came the wounds. A deep stab wound penetrated the chest cavity. Hazel rods had been driven through both upper arms, a method of restraint known as withying, used to immobilize a person completely. The cut pattern at the neck told Shepherd that the beheading had been carried out while the victim knelt forward, neck stretched, the blow delivered from behind. After death, the body had been dismembered through the abdomen. Each act of violence was distinct. Each appeared deliberate. Oldcroghan Man offered a different set of details, but pointed in the same direction. His hair had been styled using a resin-based gel containing plant oil and resin from trees native to southern Europe. This was an imported luxury product, unavailable locally, obtainable only through trade networks that extended far beyond Ireland. A man of means, a man connected to the wider world. His death had been no less violent. Multiple axe blows to the skull, any one of which would have been fatal on its own. And then there was the wound that linked them both. On each man, the left nipple had been deliberately sliced through. Not a wound inflicted in the chaos of a fight. Not incidental damage. A precise, intentional cut, placed with care on a specific part of the body. Shepherd had no hesitation. This was a signature. The same hand or the same group had killed both men. What that signature meant was another question entirely. To understand what happened to these two men, you have to understand the world they lived in. Iron Age Ireland was not a unified country. It was a landscape of hundreds of small kingdoms, each with its own ruler, its own territory, its own sacred spaces. The people left no written record. What they believed, how they governed, how they understood the relationship between the living and the dead, all of it was passed down through speech, through ritual, and through the landscape itself. At the top of each kingdom sat the king. Below him, the druids, a priestly class who spent up to 20 years in training, who kept themselves apart from ordinary society, and who were understood to possess the ability to communicate with the gods and interpret the natural world. Below them, warriors. And below them, the vast majority of people whose lives were organized around farming, animal husbandry, and survival. Kingship in Iron Age Ireland was not a birthright. It was a selection. Kings were chosen for their physical perfection, their strength, their bearing. There was a reason for this that went beyond military utility. The king was considered spiritually married to the earth goddess, not metaphorically, literally. His body was the body of the land. The health of the crops, the fertility of the cattle, the reliability of the rains, the well-being of every person in the kingdom, all of it fell under his personal spiritual responsibility. If the land flourished, the king had fulfilled his contract. If it failed, the king had failed. Crogan Hill, which rises above the bog where Oldcroghan Man was found, was the inauguration hill of the kings of this region. Kings were crowned there in ceremonies that bound them to the land and to the goddess. The bog where the bodies were discovered lies on the boundary of that same ancient territory. That boundary placement was not accidental. Bogs held a specific meaning in the Iron Age belief system. They were neither land nor water. They were threshold spaces, places where the boundary between the living world and the spirit world became permeable, where the sun, as it sank below the horizon each evening, was understood to descend into the other world. The redness of the bog water reinforced this. These were portals, sacred and dangerous in equal measure. Offerings were placed in bogs across Ireland: butter, weapons, ornamental objects, food. The Gundestrup cauldron, discovered in a Danish bog but connected to a shared Iron Age culture, carries hammered images of human figures held over cauldrons, throats cut, blood flowing. The bog was not where these men were discarded. It was where they were delivered. The bog remembers more than bodies. Locked inside the layers of compressed peat, accumulating at roughly a centimeter every 12 years, is ancient plant pollen. Scientists can read that pollen like a climate record, tracking conditions across centuries with remarkable precision. When they read the pollen from the layers corresponding to the period when Oldcroghan Man and County Offaly Man were alive, what they found was unambiguous. The climate had turned, cold, wet, persistent. The kind of conditions that do not just make life uncomfortable but make farming impossible. Crop pollen disappears from the record. Farmland shrinks. The landscape contracts around the people trying to survive on it. 2,400 years ago, the kingdom centered on Croghan Hill was facing something close to collapse. For a modern mind, crop failure is an economic crisis. For the people of Iron Age Ireland, it was a spiritual one. The gods were displeased. Something had gone wrong in the relationship between the human world and the divine one, and the person responsible for maintaining that relationship was the king. He had failed. The rains had not come at the right time, or they had not stopped. The harvest had failed. The cattle were suffering. And the people, watching their food supply diminish, would have looked to the one man whose sacred duty was to prevent exactly this. The Druids would have acted first through lesser offerings, food placed in the bog, animals sacrificed at the sacred boundaries, prayers and rituals directed at the goddess whose favor had been withdrawn. But when those offerings failed to produce results, the logic of the belief system pointed in one direction only. The offering had to be escalated, and there was nothing more valuable to offer than the king himself. The last meal consumed by Oldcroghan Man makes this sequence visible. Analysis of his digestive system showed that his regular diet had been meat-rich, the diet of a high-status individual. But his final meal was different. Cereals and buttermilk. Simple. Deliberate. In Iron Age Ireland, the provision of corn and milk was considered the central duty of a king toward his people. To feed a man his last meal from these specific foods was not random. It was a ritual statement. This is what you owed them. Now you are paying it. The hazel rods driven through his arms meant he could not resist. He knew what was coming. The walk to the bog, arms bound and bleeding, would have been the final procession of a man who had once been crowned on the hill, now visible in the distance. The Druids who had made him king were waiting. The nipple wound had puzzled investigators from the beginning. It was not a killing blow. It caused no fatal injury. It served no practical purpose in the act of execution. And yet it appeared on both men, in the same location, with the same deliberate precision. Dr. Shepard was clear. This was a signature, intentional, specific, applied by the same hand or the same group across two separate killings. The answer, when it came, arrived not from forensic science, but from a document written in the 5th century. St. Patrick, the Irish missionary whose writings recorded folklore and oral history that had been passed down through generations, noted something precise about the customs of ancient Irish kingship. The sucking of a king's nipple was a formal gesture of submission, a physical act of deference performed by those who acknowledged a king's authority over them. The implications of that single detail are considerable. If the sucking of the nipple signified submission to a king, then the deliberate slicing of it signified the opposite. It was dethronement made physical, a ritual act that stripped the man of his identity, his status, and his sacred function in a single gesture. A king with a physical blemish could not remain king. The cutting of the nipple did not just wound him, it unmade him. This reframes the entire sequence of violence visited on both men. The dethronement came first, before the stabbing, before the beheading. before the body was dismembered and placed in the bog. The man was first formally stripped of what he was. Then he was killed. The order mattered. This was not rage. It was procedure. For Ned Kelly, this was the final piece. 2 men, 40 kilometers apart, killed in the same period, bearing the same signature wound, found in bogs on the boundary of the same ancient territory. The signature injury to the nipple connected them not just to each other, but to the institution of kingship itself. These were not random victims selected for sacrifice. They were kings, deposed, dethronement marked, and then executed according to a ritual logic that their community understood completely. Grok's processing of the combined data, the forensic wounds, the status markers, the last meals, the bog placement, the pollen climate record, and the historical record from St. Patrick's writings produces a single coherent profile. 2 deposed kings, killed during a period of environmental crisis, sacrificed on the boundary of their own territory. Their bodies offered to the goddess their kingship had failed to appease. The how had been established. The why had been established. What remained was the larger question. What does it mean? Before Oldcroghan Man and County Man were pulled from the Irish Midlands, human sacrifice in Iron Age Ireland existed largely as theory. There were literary references, scattered artifacts, the suggestive imagery of objects like the Gundestrup cauldron. But the forensic evidence, the kind that could be examined, dated, and cross-referenced against climate data, historical records, and comparative archaeology, was absent. These 2 men changed that. Together, they constitute the clearest physical evidence yet recovered of Iron Age royal sacrifice in Ireland. Not sacrifice in the abstract. Sacrifice with a specific victim profile, a specific ritual sequence, a specific geographical logic, and a specific belief system driving every decision from the last meal to the placement of the body in the bog. The pattern, once visible, does not stop at the Irish border. Tolland Man in Denmark, Lindo Man in England, the Ide girl in the Netherlands. Bog bodies recovered from across Northern Europe share the same broad profile: high-status individuals, boundary bogs, signs of ritual killing, careful deposition. What had appeared to be isolated discoveries now looked like evidence of a shared belief system operating across an entire cultural world. Iron Age Europe was not a collection of isolated tribes fumbling through darkness. It was a civilization with consistent ideas about the relationship between kingship, land, divine favor, and the cost of failure. What the Irish discoveries added was specificity. The nipple wound gave investigators a ritual signature precise enough to link 2 killings separated by 40 kilometers. The pollen record gave them a motive rooted in environmental reality rather than speculation. The last meal gave them a timeline measured in hours. The inauguration hill gave them a geography that placed both deaths within the sacred boundary of a single ancient kingdom. 2 bodies found within months of each other. Same era, same region, same wounds. This was not coincidence, and it was not policy applied randomly. It was a community responding to crisis with the full force of its belief system, doing what it understood to be necessary and doing it with precision. These men did not die in secret. Their executions were witnessed, sanctioned, and carried out by the most powerful religious figures in their society. The Druids who had crowned them on the hill above the bog were the same figures who walked them to their deaths at its edge. The community knew. The community consented. Perhaps the kings themselves, raised within the same belief system, understood what was required of them. The bog preserved their bodies. But what it really preserved was the memory of a civilization's convictions, what it believed, what it demanded, and what it was prepared to do when the gods stopped listening. The bogs of central Ireland are quiet now. Dark water, compressed moss, a landscape that looks like nothing much at all until you understand what it was. 2 men were walked to these edges 2,400 years ago, crowned on the hill, killed at the boundary, placed carefully in the water that would keep them for millennium. Modern forensics gave them back their story. The wounds, the last meals, the climate record, the 5th century words of a missionary who had no idea he was preserving the key to an Iron Age murder case. All of it converged on the same conclusion. This was not savagery. This was belief, operating at its most absolute. The kings failed their people. Their people responded the only way their world made sense of failure, and the Beag remembered everything. 24 centuries later, it still does.